Hi everyone, so today it's time to talk about romance novels again. I specifically wanted to talk about a certain pattern and a certain topic that you might have noticed that I've been sort of into or reading more recently, and at least in terms of romance novels themselves. The general sort of subgenre or how should I say it? Yeah, sort of subgenre in romance, which is Native American men with white women. Over the last months, I think you've noticed that I have been reading a lot of, or at least a few different romance novels that have a white female main character, and then the love interest is a Native American man. Some of which are sort of contemporary stories, and some of which are westerns, or they take place in some other time in the past. This genre, it seems that it's taken kind of a nosedive in terms of popularity in the last decades, by which I mean since the 90s it seems that it's become a bit less popular. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be criticizing and talking about are sort of relics of the past, if you will. But I think that if this genre or subgenre or whatever were to take a sudden rise in popularity, we might see the same problems come up again. Unless of course we, I guess, criticize them and talk about them, because I feel like a lot of people in reviews and all these things haven't been very critical of these things that I have seen anyway. So yeah, I wanted to talk about them just to sort of talk about things that I haven't seen that many people talk about, and maybe there are a lot of people who are talking about it, but I just haven't I just haven't found those reviews and those criticisms, or maybe I don't know where to look. But at least in terms of YouTube and Goodreads reviews, which are the places that I tend to check out criticisms of books and stuff like that, I haven't found things of this sort. So like I mentioned, this genre or subgenre or topic general thing was really big, mostly I think especially in the 80s and the 90s. There's a few that I'm going to mention that are from the late or early 2000s, and unfortunately these books tend to range from okay, decent reads to pretty bad ones. I would say some of them are just like absolute garbage. And that's in great part due to depictions of Native Americans, not only, but I think it's a big part of why it's kind of difficult to give them a positive review or a positive rating. I've taken some books from Goodreads, from different Goodreads lists, and I'm going to use them as examples to just tell you what I'm going to talk about, give you examples of the things that I'm going to be criticizing and going to be talking about. And there's a few that weren't part of this list, but I think they still belong in the category, even if they are not in any particular Goodreads list, or they're not really, they don't have a very high spot in those lists. And some of these books I have read myself, and some of them I just kind of have read a lot of different reviews from, or I have just mostly ones that I decided that I want to read because I expected them to be pretty terrible overall anyway. I went for novels that I at least had a little bit of hope for, because with a title like Savage Ecstasy or whatever, I wouldn't bother with that. The title is basically already warning you that it's going to be terrible. I mean, obviously the word can be used in a sort of ironic way, but in a book title and for a romance novel it seems very unlikely. And from what I have seen, it seems to be not the case in this book either way, but that's not the only book that I'm going to be talking about, so don't worry. Now the thing is that books just having a racist depiction of characters or certain characters, especially main ones, it's not just a matter of being problematic or what have you, but also aside from the fact that it can often make the reader just to really make you feel kind of sick in a way that it's not really meant, obviously, for the reader to feel that way, not in a romance novel in that context either way. Also, that just kind of tends to perpetuate ideas that can be used to, or have been used throughout history, to justify things like racism or genocide. And it also just lowers the quality of the book overall. I mean, a racist depiction makes for a flat depiction, it makes for one-dimensional characters. Racist tropes make for very predictable storytelling, and prejudice will often make for really unrealistic dialogue, and sometimes dialogue that just straight up sounds ridiculous. And the main problems that I found with these books are just a few, but they are very significant ones that almost all the books in this category that I have seen have shown to some degree, which is to say a lot, because it seems that pretty much all the popular books that have this white female main character and Native American love interest, they seem to all have these issues. to either a large degree or maybe a smaller degree, but they all seem to share this, and it's almost like the authors think it's obligatory or something like that, and it definitely isn't. So I'm going to talk about specific issues that I have, and then give you, like I said, I'm going to give you examples for what I'm talking about in different books. So the main issue, probably the most significant one, is that the native love interest is often depicted as a rapist or otherwise just sexually aggressive towards the main character, who, like I said, in this category is a white woman. In Honor Bound, which is a book that I've already ranted and talked about before, the love interest kidnaps the main character, even though there's no good reasoning behind it that makes any sense. By the way, this book is contemporary. It was set and published in the 80s, so it is contemporary to that time. It's set in the contemporary times, so in that situation it doesn't make any sort of historical sense or anything. Even for the character himself, it doesn't make any sense. He'd be facing a kidnapping charge, although obviously that doesn't happen because the main character falls in love with him, but he forces her to strip, kisses her against her will, and even when they do have sex, the consent is kind of blurry at best, because the story does that really body stripper thing where she's really hesitant and he can like barely control himself, you know, which is also something that I'm gonna get to. In a Redbird Song, one of these Shawnee men tries to rape the main character, and the author makes a point though to let us know that he likes her being a redhead specifically because he'd never seen hair like that or whatever. And there are several native male characters in that novel, and most of them are not like that at all. And also the character changes, that rapist character changes throughout the story, and the author makes it clear that to the reader that the Shawnee don't condone rape even when it comes to captives. But, you know, this is still something that the author specifically makes out as a sort of phenomenon in which our native men specifically want to rape white women. And there's also Twilight, of course, which is not part of this list, but it still serves as an example because the main character has a love interest who is a native man. As you probably know, I'm talking about Jake, of course. He's not exactly a man, I guess he's more of a teenager. So in the series, at some point, Jacob kisses Belle out of nowhere, knowing that she had a boyfriend at this point already. And I guess it's more of a tame example because they're both teenagers and, you know, but the fact still stands that the author wrote this scene with a sort of sexual assault carried out by a native man. And there's some other stuff to be said about the problem with native characters in Twilight overall, but I remember very few aspects about this story, and I'm sure there's people who have already gone about it in a more in-depth way. Now, in the novel Eyes of Silver, Eyes of Gold, this trope is actually kind of subverted because the other characters want to believe that the love interest raped her, and they want her to claim to have been raped by him, but she refuses because it never happened. And it seems more as if the other people, white men in this case, want to believe or want her to claim it because they didn't really have a reason to have him hanged, you know, killed, what do you call it, you know, lynched, I guess. But even in this story, there's some degree of sexual aggression that happens from him towards her. He threatens her into undressing at some point, and, you know, she's still kind of depicted as a very cliche, virginal white girl in comparison to him, who's more like lustful and things like that. But yeah, I think Eyes of Silver is probably like the most minor in terms of using this trope. Now, Savage Ecstasy by Janelle Taylor, yeah, I wasn't joking, that was a real title. Several reviews. I didn't read this book. I didn't want to, like I mentioned, I just knew that, you know, it wasn't really gonna be something that I even really had a hope for. And several reviews mentioned that this book has the native man, the love interest or the hero, rape the main character repeatedly, but obviously this is a romance, so she falls in love with him. And one of the reviews says, "What the fuck did I just read? aka skimmed through not believing shit could be this bad in the middle of the night. Bad, so bad. How is this a book? Did I just get punked? Did I just pay Amazon $5 to punk me? The writing was horrifying, the editing even worse, the formatting was even bad. The story, what the ever-loving fuck was that?" It says the hero practically never stops beating and raping her. This isn't a romance novel. They don't even talk to each other. She's literally his slave, and that he doesn't have conversations with, and he beats the hell out of her and rapes her and threatens her with being raped by others too. And I don't know, mentally she's like 9 years old, and I think she goes on more about the book, but I think you understand what exactly I took from this review. There's something similar going on in Comanche Moon by Katherine Anderson, which is probably the most popular novel of this type, where two different reviews mention that the native men as are depicted as being sort of lustful for white women in particular. One of the reviews say, yet the other goes to the trouble of putting real Comanche words so that she can respect the culture, but not enough to make them anything more than broad-shouldered, well-muscled savages that all wish they were with white women. Except for the one guy who is the bad Comanche, he doesn't like white people at all. Another one says, the major problem I had with this is that the main character, the also special snowflake Loretta, the one foretold with hair the color of honey who will save the Comanches. I have to say I feel indignation on behalf of all living Comanches for this book. Really, I don't expect every Native American to fall to his knees in insta love shit just because he sees a blonde girl. But in this book, not only Hunter, but one of his friends as well sets his eyes on honey-haired, blue-eyed white girls as future wives. Mackenzie's Mountain by Linda Howard. It says Wolf, who is the main character, the love interest apparently, is basically treated like he's only one step away from full caveman. He works with animals, he drugs like a hunter, he is sexual and constantly horny. Being around his woman is constantly a strain on the fly of his jeans. It's a fucking miracle he doesn't bust through the zipper every time she bends over to tie her sensible shoes. So much of this book is focused on Wolf's sexual nature and how he wants to be all nasty with this perfect innocent woman, who, by the way, did I mention is a virgin, of course, and all that. So as you can see, this isn't just a problem of romance novels having rape in them. I mean, I do think that's something worth discussing, and I have mentioned it before in previous videos, but the thing that I'm referring to goes beyond the fact that there's rape in it, in these novels. It becomes sort of a problem with race as well, where you want to make the white girl out to be really virginal and hesitant to have sex, whereas the native guy is much more horny and constantly wanting her, and the most extreme case is raping her. So this straight up just white supremacist rhetoric, I know that seems really extreme for me to say, and I'm not saying that these authors are doing this on purpose. I think that this is partly like fantasy and partly because I know that people want to read this. But the point is that this is an idea that is still presented in these stories. And it also is a sort of continuation of the same trope from the, I guess, early westerns, where they would be portrayed as doing that very same thing, even though there's many testimonies from the 19th century of women who were taken by natives saying that they were never actually forced into sex, or they didn't necessarily word it that way because people were kind of euphemistic about things like that back then, but they basically said that they weren't raped. And of course there are also testimonies of women who said that they were raped from the 19th century and stuff, but I think even those westerns that are set in the 19th century are often overestimating how common that really was, and I think that's maybe an excuse that could be used nowadays to be like, well, it's historical, so it does make sense that, you know, they would rape these women or whatever, but I think it's also something that can be overblown or overdone to the point where the sheer amount of media that is portraying this thing kind of makes it seem as if it had been much more common than it really was. And I noticed that a lot of people who reviewed these books negatively did acknowledge that it had this issue with rape, the romanticization of rape, but in total I saw very few reviewers who called out these books as being racist or having racist depictions of native men or anything like that. Mostly it was commenting on the gender side exclusively. Number 2 is comparing indigenous characters to animals or associating them with the primitive or whatever overall. This one is really strange to me because it seems weird that someone writes down these words and the words are there staring back at you and you don't see how they're racist. So in Eyes of Silver, the love interest is often compared to a wolf. In Honorbound, the narrator compares him to an animal overall, or says that his feelings are animal-like, or his actions are wild or animal-like or whatever. Twilight actually had a whole wave of criticism regarding both the hypersexualization of the native men in the story and their depiction as being sort of unable to control their feelings, and specifically associating their lack of emotion with their wolfness, or I guess animalness. In Redbird's song, the main character at some point refers to the love interest as being like a wild animal, And overall, she's also made to be the typical virginal white girl while he can barely keep it in his pants. Mackenzie's Mountain has this review that says, "This book was so backwards and ridiculous, I wish I had never wasted money on it," because that's what it was. It was an absolute waste and completely offensive and racist. Half of this book is about discrimination against Native Americans, but the author does nothing except make it worse by describing the only two characters that are Native as having primitive emotions, flying into rages, being warriors, and referring to them as having sex as mating. The reviewer also adds some quotes there to give you some context, and I will have them on screen so you can read them. Pause if you want to read them. Now, the next one is probably not my biggest issue with this book, but it's also a pattern that I found among a lot of them, if not most of them, and I thought it was kind of strange, so I wanted to point it out. So something that I found is that a lot of the time these books have the native man be almost always half white. And I mean a lot of them, maybe even most of them, the ones that I have mentioned: Honorbound, Eyes of Silver, Comanche Moon, Mackenzie's Mountain, Reclaim My Heart, and Redbird's Song. Those are all fairly popular ones, and they all have this characteristic in common. And it's not really a problem in itself. I mean, after all, a lot of natives are also part white. It's not that rare, but once I started noticing this pattern, it really jumped out to me how common this was in this type of fiction. And it makes me wonder whether they wanted to have a native man because it would be different, but then make him half white so that he wouldn't be too different, you know. I did get the feeling from some of the writing in these books where the man was described, the love interest was described, his eyes were specifically described to be showing his European side. Like in Honorbound, that was very explicit. His eyes were more European according to the narrator, and I think he had gray eyes or something. In Comanche Moon, he has blue eyes, and I just don't get it. Like, what's wrong with brown eyes? They're obviously much more common among them, and I'm not assuming anything, which is why this point isn't really gonna be as strong as the rest. I mean, recessive genes just don't really work that way. I mean, it's possible, but it feels so strange that the authors almost seem to think that lighter eyes are necessarily more attractive, or they expect the reader maybe to find brown eyes not as interesting or something. And I'm assuming because I just don't know what to make of it. Like, why is it such a common occurrence? And also, even mixed natives can be part something other than white. I mean, they could be like part Asian, part black, part anything else. And I was thinking maybe I was alone in noticing this pattern, but more recently I saw a review on Redbird's Song where the reviewer acknowledges that this seems to be a common thing among these types of books. And although I only have about 6 books or so to use as examples, most of these are examples of the most popular ones in their type. So I think it's not just a problem of these individual writers or just the market, but maybe it's also something that could be said and criticized about us as readers collectively. Now, I think that romance readers are already kind of overly criticized and overly made fun of, but that doesn't mean that we're beyond criticism either. And also, I feel like maybe more romance readers would be a bit more critical of this type of thing today. But I also think it's very telling that the most popular novels of this type were also the ones that seem to be the heaviest in stereotypes and in racist tropes. And I think maybe a lot of the positive reviewers were clouded by nostalgia to some degree. So like I said, I'm not saying that these books are necessarily good or bad because of their depiction, but I do think that depiction being racist itself, like I mentioned, is already an issue, not just in terms of, I guess, the ethical implications of these novels, but also in terms of their quality. It just doesn't make for very good writing to have racism, racist depictions, racist tropes. It makes for cliches, it makes for really flat characters, like I said, and I just think it's something that we should move past. And I hope that if these types of novels become popular again, we can sort of just do different things that are necessarily like the things that I have been talking about. And I hope to see more discussion on this type of thing in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found it interesting or entertaining in some way. And tell me what you think down below again. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.